Hi, Larry Claypool here, recording at the Wise Fools Garage, otherwise known as the Bear Shop. Today we're going to do a presentation on electric fuel pumps for your collector car. And this will hopefully give you a good overview of what you need to know about electric fuel pumps before you buy one. And then we'll do a second part on how to properly install it in your Corvair. A lot of this information, especially on the how to select one, will be applicable to any kind of collector car. So you might first ask the question, what do I need an electric fuel pump for? My car came with a mechanical pump, and I bought that car in 1965. I drove that car for 20 years every day, and I never had a problem with a fuel pump. Well, what's fuel pump problems today? I don't get it. Well, three things happen, not all at once, but the first thing in the middle 80s is that the blend of the gasoline changed. They're starting to add a lot of different kinds of additives to the fuel. It was no longer just real gasoline. It had other additives in there, sometimes for the sake of cleaner air. And those additives changed the vapor point of the fuel. What's the vapor point? It's when the fuel starts to turn from a liquid into a vapor, just like you were boiling a pot of water on the stove. You know, you get it hot enough, pretty soon it starts to bubble up, and pretty soon it's bubbling over the pot. Well, the same thing happens to the fuel when you get it to a certain point. The problem is the fuel changed the point at which that happens. Cars that previously had no problem with vapor lock were now starting to have vapor lock, and that's what happened to Corvairs. So a typical vapor lock scenario is it's a hot day and you drive your car and then you park it. You shut it off and park it for more than 5 minutes, but let's say less than an hour. Say you went to get some ice cream, took the family out in the Corvair convertible, drove down to the Dairy Queen, parked the car in the parking lot, you get your ice cream, you come back to the car, and it's been 20 minutes or so since you were in line and everything. You get back in, the car starts right up, it drives for about a block, and then it feels like you ran out of gas. It just slowly kind of quit. What happened? Well, especially on Corvairs, where the engine compartment's pretty warm. Remember, air-cooled, warmed up all the air temperature inside the engine compartment, and now you've turned the engine off, and you're not moving that air around anymore. The fan is not moving, so a lot of heat in the engine compartment. The temperature of the fuel that was sitting in the fuel pump and in the fuel line that fed the fuel pump is now getting hot. And just like that pot of water, it's starting to bubble. It's starting to aerate, and it's starting to expand, because that's what happens when it starts to bubble. It can't go into the carburetors because the carburetor floats are shut off. The carburetors are already full. You're not running the engine. You didn't deplete the carburetors. So it can't try and push any fuel towards the carburetors. The only place it can go is from the fuel pump and the lines in the engine compartment, which are also hot. They're starting to push that liquid gas back towards the gas tank. So when you go to start that car in the Dairy Queen lot, you'll get it to start, but as soon as it uses up the gas that's in the carburetors, what's it got left in the fuel line and the fuel pump? Vapor. The car's not going to run on vapor, so pretty soon the car just acts like it runs out of gas. And essentially that's what happened. Yeah, I mean, you still got gas in the tank, but it's not back here at the engine where you need it. And that can happen even if you don't shut the car off. You're in let's say a parade with the car, a nice hot 4th of July parade, and you're idling through the parade, and after about 20 minutes it feels like you're kind of running out of gas. Well, same scenario happens. You're idling, you're using a very small amount of fuel, so the temperature is hot in the engine compartment, the fuel pump's getting hot, the lines are getting hot. Pretty soon vapor is in there, and you don't have liquid fuel anymore to pump in the carburetors, and your car quits in the middle of the parade. Talk about embarrassment. You got to push the car. Hey, you guys standing here watching me, can you help push the car out of the way for the rest of the parade? So that was the first thing that happened for the demise of the mechanical pump is the gasoline changed. And today we still have gasoline that has a lower vapor point than the stuff we used to use. So vapor lock is a problem, and probably more so a problem on Corvairs because of the high engine compartment temperature. That's just the way it is. The second thing that happened is kind of related to the first thing, and that is the fuel pumps. AC division of General Motors made the fuel pumps, and just like the guy who bought his car brand new in '65, we really didn't have much problem with fuel pumps. I mean, there were, obviously some of them failed. Back in the '60s, there were all kinds of people making fuel pumps. The AC division, of course, original supplier was making them. Carter was making them. electirc was making them. There's probably 4 or 5 different companies making fuel pumps because it was a common replacement item back in the day. And back in the day, they had sold almost 2 million Corvairs. Obviously, that's a number of fuel pumps that might need to be replaced. Well, move the clock up into the middle '80s. Well, now it's been 16 years since the last Corvair was made. There aren't 2 million of them out there anymore. And AC, I think that what happened is suddenly people were buying a lot of fuel pumps because they were thinking the fuel pump's gone bad. This car never vapor locked before. What the heck's going on with this thing? The fuel pump's no good. Buy another pump. So suddenly there was a kind of a spike in the sales of Corvair pumps. AC was probably low on stock and looked and said, I don't think we're going to make another run of these things. We just don't sell enough of them to bother. There's plenty of other companies out there. We're going to do a rebox job. So previously, our fuel pump on the top was stamped into the top of the case that said AC, made in USA, and then a part number on it. And pretty soon, we would open up our AC spark plug box, our AC fuel pump box, open up, and there's a new fuel pump in there, and the top casting just says made in USA. It doesn't say AC on it anymore. It still says made in USA, but AC isn't on there and the part number isn't on there. What do we know about that? The tag on it, the part number tag, is often stamped AC. They just added that little AC stamp so they knew that on the removable tag to know that, okay, yeah, that's a pump that we sold. We'll warranty that. But it changed. The manufacturer changed on the pump, and we started to get a lot of pump failures, whether it was because of the additives that were in the fuel now that were causing the diaphragms to go bad, or the casting was changed. Maybe the aftermarket one wasn't as robust, or the quality wasn't quite there. I can't tell you exactly what went wrong, but I know that certainly by the early 90s, we were starting to have pretty much epidemic failures of mechanical pumps. The main thing was that they would leak. There's a vent hole on the base of the pump, right about the 5 o'clock position if you're looking down at the pump from above, and you'd start to see gas dribbling out of here. Sometimes the diaphragms would fail spectacularly and gas would be squirting out the top vent hole. Serious problem. Anytime you have liquid fuel in your engine compartment, that's bad news. And it was an epidemic problem. We put a new fuel pump on the car, and a couple weeks later, a year later, it was, if you got a year out of a fuel pump, you did good. You did good. So reliability of the pumps has been poor. That has been a challenge ever since the early 90s of finding a fuel pump that works. There's been lots of manufacturers in the past. It has slimmed down to probably the last one was electirc, who made the last batch of pumps, and around 2019 electirc certainly had some reliability issues. No longer were they made in the USA. Production moved elsewhere. The castings changed. They were retooled. They just didn't work as well. And same problem. You'd get fuel pumps that would either just simply not pump or they would leak. And I think in about 2019, electirc just threw in the towel, says, we're not going to make these things anymore. So suddenly, from having a poor replacement, we had no replacement fuel pumps. And that's kind of the situation where we're at right now in the summer of 2023. Now, somebody will say, "But yeah, Clark's is making one." Well, yes, they're in the works. They are not available at this time. And they had hoped to be released in late 2022, but they're still not available at this time. So how well will the Clark's one work? Well, we don't know. We don't have any to test. But I know Cal is working diligently to try and make those available. But at this time, we don't. We don't have any good source. If somebody came to me today and says, "Hey, I need a mechanical fuel pump for my car," I tell them, good luck, because there's none out there you can readily buy. Oh, but I see them listed on Rock Auto. There's a one from US Motor Works. There's several other brands. There's at least 3 brands that are listed on Rock Auto this minute. Yeah, there was a company called US Motor Works, ironically, because their fuel pumps are made in China. And we tested, actually Mike Dawson tested some of those. The first problem that raised a red flag is there's a indentation hole that centers the fuel pump with its mounting bolt, so it goes in exactly the right position. They didn't have it. They weren't drilled. It was completely round, all around the base. You had no idea where's the right position for the fuel pump. Second was that the pressures were way off the scale when testing these fuel pumps. They just flat didn't work. And now, with the other companies that list their pump, do you suppose all those other companies started to tool up brand new tooling for electric pump, or mechanical pump? Of course they didn't. They simply bought the US Motor Works pump, which was no good to begin with, and boxed it in their own box. So right now, even though you might be able to buy a pump, you cannot buy a pump that actually works right now, or works well enough that you can reliably use this thing for several years. So that's a problem with it. The third thing that came about, which changed the fuel picture, is the way we drive the cars now. I mean, back in the 70s, lots of us were driving our Corvairs as everyday cars. And, you know, we didn't really have much of a problem with fuel pumps. Just wasn't much of a problem. Nowadays, moving the clock up 50 years, most of us are driving them as hobby cars. You might take them to the club meeting, you might go to a cruise night, so the car gets driven really once or twice a week. Some of you have multiple cars, and so you rotate a little bit. Well, that one car that you drove last Monday, it might not get driven for 2 or 3 weeks. And what happens now, we talked about that lower vapor point of the fuel. That means in ambient temperatures, it also evaporates much quicker. So by the time you go to use that car that you just used 2 weeks ago, the carburetors are empty. Where did it go? You didn't run it. It evaporated, okay? That's why when you park your Corvair in an enclosed garage where everything's closed up, you pull it in with a hot engine and you go in the house, you come out 15 minutes later, you open up the little service door in the garage and you go, "Whoa, it smells like gas in here. I must have a gas leak." Probably not. I mean, you could have a gas leak, but it's more likely it's the fuel in the carburetors evaporating, especially with a hot engine. When you just shut it off, you know, they don't have any vapor recovery on cars before about 1970. So all those gas fumes are filling up your garage. That's why you smell so much gas fumes. And over the course of a week, the fuel has all evaporated out of the carburetors. You go to start the car, and it used to be it would fire right up. Well, now it doesn't. How come? Because the carburetors are dry. They're empty. All the fuel evaporated out. You've got to crank the engine for a long time before the fuel pump fills the carburetors back up, and now the engine will finally start. So those are the 3 things that have brought us to the 2020s and have made an electric fuel pump a big consideration in operating your collector car. So if you properly select the right fuel pump for your car, install it correctly, the car will start right up after a long period of sitting and pretty much eliminate the vapor lock problems. So that's how we're going to deal with life in the 2020s with our collector car. So we're going to help try and show you what to do and what to look for in your pump. Well, now that I've talked you into an electric fuel pump, this might maybe the answer to your fuel delivery problems on your car. Let's take a look at the different kinds of pumps, because there are many different kinds of pumps. If you just go on your computer and type in external electric fuel pumps, you're going to come up with a list about a mile long. And how do you know which is the right one for your car? Because they are different. You need to know the differences to select the right one. Electric fuel pumps are not a new thing. I mean, they just suddenly didn't arrive. They were available in the early 50s. One of the styles we have here today, the Cube style, that came out in 1950. The Cube was available. And the Bendix style, that also came out in the 50s. So it was not a new thing. This is a rotary vane pump. It has an electric motor inside, a small electric motor, and vanes, and they spin around in this chamber area, and that's what pumps the fuel. These have been around forever. These are really good high volume pumps. If you want a transfer pump to move gas from one tank to another, something like that, these are great because they're not necessarily high pressure, but they move a lot of fuel. So for some special applications, the rotary vane is maybe a good choice. Also, when we demonstrate these pumps, I'm going to power up these pumps both on the bench here so you can hear what the sound level they make, and I'm going to power them up as installed on some vehicles while they're actually pumping fuel, because you know the sound it makes with running on the bench isn't as important as how loud is it in the car. So I've got a variety of these different kinds of pumps on various cars of mine, and we'll show you that in a bit. But that's a rotary vane type. They're available today in a number of places. They're sold by a number of companies, and that's one style. For our use on regular passenger cars, a rotary vane, you probably don't need it because it's not very compact. This thing's a pretty big pump. It's pretty heavy, and a lot of times, especially on a Corvair, we don't have a lot of room to work with. You know, you get a pump like that, and it's going to be hanging the lowest point on the bottom of the car. You don't want that. You don't want your fuel pump to get knocked off when you go over a low-slung driveway hump. So, rotary vane, like I say, high volume. And for our purposes, in most passenger cars, we don't need really high volume. So that's one style that's been around forever. This one is a solenoid pump. Solenoid pumps are very popular. These right here in the middle of the display are all, I'm going to exclude that one from it. All of these right in the middle here are all solenoid style pumps. So they come in a great number of sizes and shapes and volumes and pressures. So let's just talk about the ones that you're most likely to find when you're looking out there for pumps. The first one is going to be kind of the round can style. Okay, it's about 2/3 the size of a beer can, and it's got the filter on it. All these fuel pumps, every single one of them, either comes with a filter on the inlet or highly recommends it by the manufacturer. All of them say that you absolutely have to run a filter on the inlet of this to prevent debris from getting inside, because if you got a gas tank full of crap, pretty soon you're going to have a fuel pump full of crap and it's going to stop working. I mean, that's simple as that. So all of them have to have a fuel pump plumbed in the system somewhere. This is a common style. There's a whole bunch of these out there on the internet, and it looks like a can. Some of them have threaded fittings on either side, usually 1/8 or a 1/4 inch national pipe thread, and then so you can put a hose barb on there, or sometimes if you need to do a little plumbing work to get it to fit your situation, you can put in a 90-degree fitting on here so you can shorten the effective overall length of it. Some of them have just a hose barb that's made onto the pump, and you can't really change that. So that's a little bit of a limiting factor. It limits your mounting options. Here's a Delphi. Delphi is now a part of Borg-Warner, and they have a pump with 1/4 inch national pipe thread fittings. Again, same type of deal. It can be plumbed with either the enclosed filter in the box, or you can put in any kind of hose barb or 90-degree or 45-degree fitting, whatever you need to use. The cube pump. The cube is made by Faucet. They're in Elmira, New York, and this is one of the few pumps that's engineered and assembled here in the United States. Most of the pumps that you buy today are outsourced to China. That doesn't automatically mean they're bad, but I think we have to be careful with some of our choices of the pumps made elsewhere. The Faucet pumps have been made in Elmira since the 50s under various corporations, but it's been the same plant. And they've done the cube style. The cube is very compact. It's a nice little compact solenoid style pump. When I talk about solenoid, it's got a little piston inside that runs back and forth, okay, and that's what does the pumping action. And the modern ones like this are all electronic. You know, when the pump plunger gets to a certain point, it breaks contact, it springs back to charge it again, and then keeps going back and forth like a solenoid. Modern ones are electronic, no points in them. The old style ones had points inside that would eventually, you know, go bad, just like the points in the distributor. But modern ones are all fully electronic, and there are numerous, there's over 20 different versions of this pump in different voltages, different pressures, different electrical connectors, and some have a positive displacement valve that we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's another style. There's a variation of the cube, and this is called their PosiFlow. It's also a Faucet product, and it is a plastic composite version of the cube. It's basically the cube pump inside of here, but the plastic housing helps quiet it down some, so it's not quite as loud in operation. And you'll see that when we do our volume tests. There's a heavy-duty solenoid pump. This was originally a Bendix design, and Faucet now makes it again in Elmira. And this is a really good heavy-duty pump. The only disadvantage to it, it's pretty big. You know, this is not a little pump by comparison. But what it does have at the one end is a built-in screen filter. So you can take off the end of this. You don't have to plumb a filter in line because it's already integral to the pump. So this is a good heavy-duty pump. Again, available in several variations of pressure and voltages for other types of cars. And the fittings are on the side of it. So it's a good heavy-duty style pump. So that's also another option. Again, you know, we have to take into consideration the mounting space. On every electric pump, it has to be mounted near the gas tank. The rule of thumb is within a foot of the tank. Because these pumps are all great pushers. They push along fuel good. Suction, and not so good. They're not really designed to be a suction pump. I know some people have said, I just put that in my engine compartment and it worked fine. Well, there's all kinds of reasons you shouldn't, and we'll get into that when we get to the installation part. But really, it needs to be down by the gas tank, which is typically the furthest point away from the engine, because remember when we talked about vapor lock, if we put our electric pump in the engine compartment, well, where's all the heat at? In the engine compartment. It's not going to be able to capture fuel that's liquid over by the tank and push it back through the lines if it's already in the engine compartment where the vapor is. So electric fuel pump is not going to be very effective when it's close to this heat source, and also if it's far away from the tank. Again, it doesn't have as good a suction as it does pressure. So keep that in mind, and that's going to dictate what style pump, as far as how much room do we have to work with to safely put this underneath the car. So solenoid pumps come in lots of different shapes, sizes. There's also modern cars, you know, everything now has some sort of fuel injection. And which brings us to the point, not a point, but a fun little quiz. What's the first standard production American-made car that had a electric fuel pump as standard equipment? Okay, put on your propeller beanie there. Think about that for a minute. Now, if you've heard my presentation before at one of the Corsa conventions, you already know the answer because this is one of my little fun little quizzes I gave during it. But in case you didn't remember or you haven't heard one of them before, it may surprise you to learn. Now, people say, oh, the Vega. I remember the Vega. They had electric fuel pump in it. Well, yes, the Vega did have an electric fuel pump, but it was not the first. The first was the 1969 Buick Riviera. Yeah, the 69 and 70 Buick Riviera had a standard electric fuel pump mounted in the tank. And that was used as kind of a test out. GM would do that on fairly low volume cars that were more expensive. They could build that feature into the price of an expensive car without changing the price of the car much. So they wanted to get some real world data on how this electric fuel pump is going to work out before they put it in a high volume car like the Vega. So, you know, the Vega sold in the hundreds of thousands. The Riviera was typically selling around 50,000 at the time. So that gave them some good feedback on how the electric fuel pump is going to work in the real world. And then, of course, it did become standard on the Vega cars. And then later on, into the 80s, we started to get manufacturers having electric fuel pump in the tank, because that's when we first started to get into some of the early fuel injected cars. And again, with the fuel changes and stuff, it became necessary to get that cooler fuel coming into the engine compartment to prevent vapor lock, which of course could happen on any kind of car with a fuel pump mounted in the heat of the engine. So, fun little thing. Those pumps mounted in the tank were not solenoid pumps. Okay, what they came up with is a different style pump. It's called a gear rotor. Inside, it's a slim style pump, and inside the pump is almost like a ring gear type arrangement with a small little gear that turns it, and that makes a suction. It's similar to some oil pumps, and it's a quieter pump, and you'll hear that when we do our little audio test on them. And they're generally pretty reliable. These are what all new cars have, is some sort of gear rotor style pump. I shouldn't say all. Most cars have a gear rotor style pump inside the tank. And these are a nice style pump. They're very compact. They're very skinny, and that helps us in our overall operating length of the pump that we're going to use. So that's another style. And then finally, I know some of you might ask, well, if all the new cars use an in-tank style pump, can't we do that on a Corvair? And the answer is, yeah, sure. Ted Brown of CorvairEFI.com. Ted has made an electric fuel pump setup which uses a brand new reproduction stainless steel sending unit with a Vega style pump. Now, why the Vega style pump? Well, remember, back in the day in '71, of course, very few cars had fuel injection then. On American cars, pretty much, with very few exceptions, still using a carburetor, and that's of course what the Vega used. So this is a low pressure electric pump designed for a carburetor, but used inside the gas tank. So it's a small pump, it's a gear rotor style pump, pretty quiet. And Ted has modified the sending unit to accept the electric fuel pump on the end of it. And we've got a cutaway tank here when we're going to show you, when we get into the mounting and everything of the tanks, how this one works and fits inside the Corvair tank. So these different pumps all have different operating characteristics. The first one you need to know is what size pump is going to work for me. So you have to look at your car and see what's the available space. Where's your fuel line go? Where does your fuel tank outlet go? How much room have I got? Remember, we talked a little bit before, you don't want the fuel pump to be the lowest thing on the car, because if you get in a situation where the car bottoms out, you don't want to rip the fuel pump off. And the second is you need it to be away from anything warm, away from exhaust pipes, away from anything that moves, suspension parts. You don't want anything rubbing this fuel pump. It's got to be in a reasonably protected place. So that may dictate which style pump you can use. Remember, the cube style pumps are pretty compact, both the PosiFlow and the cube. The solenoid pumps can be fairly compact. They get a little bit long depending upon whether you have fittings or hose barbs. You can get around it by putting on some angled brass fittings if you want. The rotary vane, good pump, but big and heavy and tall. So different pumps, different mounting situations. So know first what your available space is. The second thing you have to know is how much pressure do I need? Almost every single pump is available in at least 2 different pressures. Most commonly, there's a 2 to 4 psi rating for most of these pumps, and then there's a 4 to 6, or it might be 4 to 7, 4.5 to 7, and then there's the higher pressure ones, which are like 7 to 9 psi. Some of them are available in that range. You first have to know what is the specification for your car. What did the factory want the fuel pressure to be? So if you look in your factory shop manual, in your specification section, there should be a range stated for the mechanical fuel pump that your car had to begin with. As far as Corvairs go, that specification is about 5 psi. For instance, the gas heater on the Corvairs has a pressure regulator, and that regulator is supposed to be set between 4.5 and 5.5 psi. And most of the shop manuals will say that it's right around 5 psi, and specifically the shop manual says that. So you want at least 5 psi. And I have found in testing pumps, because I have tried to find the pump that's really the best. Most of these pumps, if they have a specification, let's say is 4 to 6 psi, will be on the lower range of that specifications. In other words, if I had a pump that was, say, 4 to 6 range, if I put my fuel pressure gauge on it, and you'll see me testing it when we get into it, if it made, let's say, 4.25 psi, okay, it's in specification. That means it's going to pass and get shipped. But if you really thought it was going to be at 5 psi, because you wanted 5 psi, it could be anywhere between 4 to 6, so it really wasn't 5. It was 4.25, but it was doing what it was supposed to. You might be disappointed at that. So what I have found is most of these pumps will perform at the lower end of their rating. So the 4 psi pump, like I say, if it makes 4, that it's in specification. If you're thinking it will make 6, it might. There's a little variation between everyone, but know that specification, what the pump is rated for, and also know what the factory says the engine needs. That's very important. When you're looking for those specifications, when you find a fuel pump, you decide that, well, one of these is going to work fine for me, that's going to fit where I need it to go, and it's got hose barbs, I can change the angle coming out and everything. Look at the manufacturer's, if you're buying this from, let's say, Amazon or eBay, I have found in particular that Amazon specifications leave something to be desired and their description of the parts. I've seen it so bad that they have a pump that's obviously a solenoid pump, and in the description it says it's a gear rotor style pump. Clearly wrong. So what you need to do is look on that description of the pump, look at the part number that is listed for that pump and then go to the manufacturer's website and check out the manufacturer's specifications for the pump and see if it's really what you think it's going to be. Because I've found either misinformation or missing information on some of the big resellers' sites. They might not tell you the size of the inlet or the outlet. They might not tell you the pressures, and even if they do, they might be wrong. Trust the manufacturer's specification for what you're looking for. That's important. The other thing I want to talk about is quality of the pumps. You know, I mentioned that a lot of this stuff is made overseas. I mean, that's just the way it is in today's world. There are many, many products made overseas, and some of them not so good. As I said, if you look up on any of the big websites for electric fuel pumps, you're going to find hundreds of choices, hundreds of choices. Some of the names you'll recognize: Faucet, Delphi, Carter, Airtex. And you'll also find a lot of them that don't have any name on them at all. Some that have a name that, well, I never heard of these guys before. What do? Or some that look like, well, that's a faucet pump. Well, it's not. There's a lot of copycats out there. This little pump, the Cube, has been copied by so many different companies over the years that it looks just like the Cube pump. It's the same size, but it's not a faucet pump. It's a knockoff pump. And what I would suggest is, when you're looking at pumps, how do you know which one is the best one, or if it's going to work at all? I'd start by looking at the available selling price of this. This pump was about 12 bucks delivered. $12 delivered. How long do you suppose this pump is going to run? Will I get 20 years out of it, like I got out of this old Carter pump, which is still working? I probably don't think this one's going to last 20 years. In fact, it lasted about 1 year, a very sparing use. I just took this out of my car and put in a faucet pump. On a pump like this, let's say it goes bad, and some of them even come with a lifetime warranty. Okay, lifetime warranty, that's great. All right, it goes bad. Where do I return this to? Do we ever hear of these guys? I don't know who they are. Obviously, you want to keep the receipt of anything you buy. I would keep the box it came in. Sometimes the manufacturer said it must be in the original shipping material. And put that where you're going to be able to find it. Put it on your garage shelf, mark it fuel pump for X car. And, you know, if it's someplace like this, you're hoping the guy that sold it, because you don't know who made it, the guy that sold it will still be in business a year from now when it quits. Will you still be in business 5 years from now? Don't know. Stick with a major company that has a reputation. Delphi, part of a big corporation, Borg Warner. The Faucet Company, part of Faucet Purelator. I mean, they've been around since 1950. So Carter, been in business forever. Airtex. Stick around, buy a pump that the company's going to be around in 5, 10 years, when, you know, you do need to get that warranty taken care of, and they'll be around. You can, you still got to keep your receipt in your box to really make this an easy process. But if you stick with a name brand company, yeah, some of them are made overseas. But if you got a name brand, the company will still back you up with it. And hopefully the engineering of the pump was still here, done in the USA, and they've done some proper quality control, which is the big thing. You know, China can make stuff, but is the quality control there? I think a lot of times that boils down to the consumer. Oh, that one didn't work. I guess that's not a quality controlled one. But a good company will test it. For instance, the faucet pumps, every single faucet pump It's assembled in New York, and they'll come with plugs in the pump itself, because if you take the plug out of a faucet pump you just bought and tip it on its side, you'll get a little bit of fluid that comes out of the pump, because every single one is pressure tested at the factory to make sure it's in the specs and that it works. I don't see that going on with any other pump here, and I've tried all of these, but the faucets, I'm pretty confident that all these are going to work right out of the box with no problem. Things do change with the manufacturers. For instance, the Carters here, this Carter inline gear rotor style pump, this was my go-to pump for years. It was nice and quiet. It was skinny. It fit under the floor of an early model Corvair very well, and I liked it. It did have its disadvantage, is that it's got a hose barb at either end, and by the time you get a filter on there, it makes it pretty long. Sometimes we don't have that much mounting space that we can easily mount this, but I got around that, and you'll see that when we get into the installation of it. But it was my go-to pump, and about 2 years ago now, I started to get the pump with this nice, shiny, smooth body, and I noticed that it changed. Previously, it had 5/16 inlet and a 5/16 outlet. It happens to be the size of many cars, including Corvairs. The new one, nice and shiny, 5/16 outlet, or inlet rather. This is the inlet end. And 3/8 on the other end. Two different sizes. And now the fuel filter is also a 3/8 size on the inlet. Why did that happen? Well, my old one here, that's still working, that I bought ages ago, says on it, Carter. Got the part number on it, and stamped right on the pump, made in USA. Nothing stamped, oh, it is stamped on here. It's in lettering, not encased in it. It's got a serial number, and it gives a part number, and it's not made in USA anymore. It's made in China. So I have had a couple failures of the Chinese-made pump. One of them had just made so much pressure it buried the gauge and blew out the mechanical pump still on the car. Company warrantied it, no questions asked. I've had a couple of them that have been under advertised pressure. I sent them back. They replaced them with no problem. I'm leery of some of these, but they stood behind it, and I have been pressure testing all of them that I use to make sure they're within the spec that I want to see. Down the street, the other gang, electirc, made a fine little pump. I found it's actually a little more compact than the Carter pump. It had a hose barb on the outlet, 5/16 style, and a 1/8 inch national pipe thread fitting on the inlet where the filter goes, so you could screw in something else if you wanted, a 90-degree fitting or something. Nice little compact gear rotor style pump, nice and quiet. When I found out about these, after I was a little disappointed at the change in the Carters, I rushed to buy some of these. I ordered 3, and that was all I could find anywhere. They discontinued them. What happened? Well, corporate mergers, electirc and Carter, separate companies, until not too long ago, and they're all under the Trico brand now. So Trico probably looked at the offerings of each company, and they probably decided that why do both companies have a similar product selling to the same kind of market? External, low pressure, gear rotor style pump. You guys don't need to compete against each other. Let's consolidate what we're selling, and it went away. It's discontinued. It's a great pump, we can't get it anymore. So the Carter is the one that's left out there on the market. It is readily available, but it doesn't, afraid to say it, it doesn't have the quality of the old USA made ones, and that's unfortunate. But again, some of these are even offered with lifetime warranties. The Delphi is offered with lifetime warranty, and the Carter is also offered with a lifetime warranty. So as long as you keep all your receipts and the box, they'll stand behind it. But I say there's a lot of choices here. The other thing, remember, is to check your space available and the pressure you need, because those are two important factors of having a successful electric fuel pump installation. Okay, in this part of the video, I'm going to do a little sound test, and this is also going to be two parts. What I want to do is power up a couple of different styles of pumps we have here, so you can get just a relative idea how much noise they're going to make. Now, this will vary, of course, between just open, free running and when they're actually under pressure. And an important thing to remember on any of these pumps is they should not be operated for any length of time without fuel in them, especially the gear rotor style pump, because these pumps require the fuel in there to be part of the lubrication of the gear system, the pump system in there. So we only want to run this for a very few seconds without actually having fuel available to it. And that's why they always tell you, on a modern car, don't let that thing run out of gas, because that's tough on the fuel pump when it does. So we don't want to ruin any of these. But this will give you a little bit of an idea of what the different sound levels are. It will change when it's under pressure, and we're going to show you that too, because we've got a lot of these different kinds of fuel pumps installed in cars around here, and we're going to listen from in the interior at the driver's seat at the kind of sound they make when the pump is working hard to fill the carburetors, and then what it sounds like when it's actually under pressure and the needle valves in the carburetors are shut. So let's first start with the one of the older style pumps. This is a rotary vane pump. Remember, we said that this was a high volume pump, and it's got a motor going through it instead of a solenoid. So let's power up this one. Okay. Covering up the inlet and outlet. Sounds like a motor, because that's what it's got. Got a couple different solenoid style pumps here. I'm not sure what brand this one is. I kept it around because it still works. It's old. A rattler. That's what solenoid pumps sound like, is a rattler. Here's another solenoid pump, different brand. Not sure which one this is, what brand. But most of the solenoid pumps will sound very similar to each other. Here's our brand new Delphi pump. This is the knockoff Chinese cube style pump. That's loud. It's hammering. Let's see here. Now I'm gonna hook up the faucet pump here, and I'm gonna expect I might get a little fluid coming out of here, because they do factory test these and pressure test them. So we might get a little bit of a squirt out of this. And it's pretty noisy too. Let's try the faucet cube pump. Again, we might get a little bit of fluid out of here. Did in fact get some fluid out of there. As I said, the factory pressure tests all of these to make sure they're in specification and that they actually function. So that's That's a perk for you folks buying the faucet. You know it's going to work. So here's an unknown pump. It's a solenoid style pump, we think. We think it is. Again, the specifications were kind of sketchy on it. We're not sure if that's what it is. Yep. Solenoid style. This is the one that failed after only less than a year of very little use. Makes a little spark. That's it. It's dead. Here's our big one. I know this has some fluid in it because we took off the cover off of this one so you could see the built-in screen in it. This is the faucet here. Oh yeah, sure. It's got quite a bit in there. So we're going to power this one up. Let you hear this again. You only want to power this for a moment. You don't want to run these things dry. Okay. That's the big heavy duty one. Then we have, so all of the solenoid pumps, will make a rattling sound. Okay, that's normal for them. That's what they do. When they get under pressure, when the pressure builds up, they get quieter. So we'll show you that too. So don't be alarmed at some of these that sound like a rattle can going on underneath the car when it's empty. We'll show you when we get some actual pressure going to them. Let's take a look at this is the Carter P60430, which is the gear rotor style pump. Now there's two terminals, of course, positive and negative. There's a little plus and minus on these terminals. You really have to look to see them. Obviously, you've got to keep the polarity correct. So when you're installing the wiring on these, make sure you pay attention to this. That's it. Just a little electric motor. Very quiet. This is one of the reasons I was drawn to the gear rotor style pump. Again, don't run them long because it'll damage them. So those are the basic styles: the gear rotor, the solenoid, and the rotary vane. So that's the kind of sounds levels that we'll get, but we're going to show you also what they sound like in the car. Okay, we're going to go around to a couple of my cars here, and we're going to turn the ignition on so you can hear the actual sound of a pump installed pumping gas, both with and without pressure. This is a Hillman Imp. We're going to turn the pump on. The pump is located just forward of our gear shift lever down here. It's a solenoid style round can pump. This is with the carbs empty. Okay, you could hear it was noisier with the carbs empty. The carbs would be full by now. So with it running, you can still hear it, but it's not particularly loud. If we were to turn the ignition back on, now that the line's fully pumped up, that's the normal sound of a solenoid pump when it's mounted so close by. Okay, here we are in an AMC Eagle. This has a gear rotor style pump mounted near the gas tank. So now this is a front engine rear drive car with the tank mounted approximately behind the right rear passenger. Okay, that's the normal sound of the pump. We'll start it up. Okay, with the normal sound of the car running, we pretty much can't hear that pump anymore. Okay, now we're in the 66 Tornado. This one, obviously front engine, with a rear-mounted gas tank. We have a heavy-duty solenoid faucet pump, the one that looks like a beer can, mounted on the cross member here, just by the passenger rear foot, behind the passenger's rear foot. Okay, the pump's just coming up to pressure. This car hasn't been started in about a month now, so it took maybe 10 seconds to fill up the carburetor. Let's see what it does for it. All right, let's hear it with the engine off but the pump on. Pretty quiet. I don't think we can hear that at all with it running. I'll put the camera down by the back seat area closest to where the pump is at. No, can't hear it at all with the engine running. Okay, this one is in a Corvair Lakewood wagon, and the pump is mounted just about under the passenger's left foot. It's a old AC Delco solenoid pump that's probably 30 years old, but still working fine. So let's hear it. Okay, now that's its normal sound with it under pressure. And it's pretty much, can't even hear that one run. Once the motor's running. So let's turn that back on for a second with the engine off now that it's pumped up pressure. Pretty quiet. Okay, here we are in the 61 Pontiac Tempest. Again, front engine car. The electric fuel pump is a gear rotor style. It's mounted just forward of the left rear wheel. I can hear that running. I'm sure it's made pressure. This car hasn't been running about 3 months. Let's see what it'll do. Oh, let's put it in neutral. Okay. Let's turn that pump back on. All right, here's our rotary vane pump. Now, I don't actually have a rotary vane pump installed on any cars, but I do have one here I use as a transfer pump. It's great for filling up gas tanks or emptying gas tanks. So I'm going to power this one up so you can get an idea of what the rotary vane pump sounds like. Okay, first powering under no load. It's not in the fuel yet. Pretty quiet. But now, when I start to tell it to work, okay, the rotary vane pumps get quite a bit noisier when they're under load. For a race car, that'll be fine, you don't care, high volume pump. But for most passenger cars, this one's really kind of overkill because of the noise it makes. All right, here's Shelley's 65 Monza convertible. We have the electric in-tank gear rotor style pump on this car. It pretty much makes the same sound whether the carbs are pumped up or not on this car. So one thing we want to talk about on any electric fuel pump installation is some sort of safety device to turn the fuel pump off in the case of an accident. All modern cars have such a device on them, and it's certainly a worthwhile and important consideration in your installation. For instance, say you get rear-ended real hard in your car and you're unable to turn off the ignition. That means your car could be badly crashed, the seat back may have collapsed, you're sitting where the back seat is, and you can't reach that ignition switch. Maybe you're knocked out or worse, and your fuel pump is still sitting there pumping gas in a crashed car. Not a good scenario. So there's a couple ways that we can accomplish this, and it's certainly a consideration in installation of a pump. And the first style of car with the electric pump of any mass production in the USA, the Vega, they used an oil pressure switch that had 3 terminals on it. One of them was to operate the low oil pressure light, which was off and on a Vega. And then in addition, there's 2 more terminals which are normally open when there's no pressure, and those 2 terminals closed when there was pressure. So that's how the fuel pump was wired. As soon as the engine got oil pressure, the contact was made, and the power coming into these 2 terminals was transferred to the fuel pump. Okay, and that's one way you can do this. You could replace your stock oil pressure switch with a 3-terminal switch and do the associated wiring so that the positive feed to the fuel pump first has to go through the oil pressure switch. Now in the aftermarket, there's other switches that are made. It's just 2-terminal alone. You use this switch. The 2-terminal style is just for the oil pressure switch, and you leave your stock oil pressure switch in place. If you do that, that means you got to put a T-fitting and some plumbing and stuff up by the oil pressure switch. If it's a Corvair, I'm not fond of that idea, because now you got a bunch of plumbing sitting right next to the fan belt. I've had it happen where a car with that kind of setup flips a belt, and the belt comes along and whacks that plumbing off, breaks the little piping and stuff. Not thrilled about it. If you really want that kind of setup, Clark sells a special oil filter bolt that's drilled and tapped in the middle of the bolt. It's called an adaptabolt. So you can use your separate oil pressure switch on the filter mount, and you have your stock switch in its normal location. So you'll actually have 2 different senders, but they're safely placed where the fan belt won't interfere with either one. That's one way to do it. I'm not especially excited about that kind of a setup for a couple of reasons. First off, it means that your electric fuel pump won't start to run until the engine builds up oil pressure. So first you've got to crank the engine to get the oil pressure built up. Then it flips on your electric fuel pump, and now you still have to keep cranking it long enough for the electric fuel pump to fill the carburetors up. So you're filling up the oil galleries, and then you're filling up the carburetors. That's a lot of cranking time, and we want to try and avoid that. Easier on the starter, easier on the battery. But that's one way you could do it, and some people have done it. Another disadvantage with the oil pressure type switch is the amount of extra wiring it takes to do this, to do it properly, and that is to run the 2 power wires to and from the oil pressure switch up through the tunnel of the car, the control tunnel underneath, run the wires all the way along properly along the wiring harness. You've got to take out the tow pan cover next to the gas pedal and run the wiring up through there, and hopefully nobody has glued your carpet in. Factory carpets were not glued in, and if you glue in the carpets, guess what happens when you try and peel them back to get that tunnel cover off? Almost time to buy a new carpet, because it's going to wreck the carpet. So listen to that, upholstery shops. and owners who put your own carpeting in, don't glue it down in the front because you need to get that off to service that area. Anyway, to do that job properly, and I mean properly, along the main wiring harness, all nicely wire tied together, as opposed to just running it under the carpet and drilling a hole in the back to run the wire out. To do that properly is going to take as long to run that wire properly as it would to put the rest of the fuel pump on the car. It really increases the installation time significantly to do that job. Now, if you really like the oil pressure switch type of safety control, I'd recommend this one instead. This is a special oil pressure switch made just for this purpose as a safety switch. It's got 3 terminals like the rather ordinary oil pressure switch. This shorty switch is the right size for Corvairs. It's very short as opposed to the tall ones. A tall one gets pretty close to the alternator or generator pulley. So this one, if you were to use it, you need to use a 45-degree angle adapter to get it away from the generator pulley so it's not too close. If you've got a turbo model, it's already on an adapter for your oil pressure feed, so it's not a problem. But in any event, this switch has got 3 terminals too, but it's wired completely differently than a standard oil pressure switch. This one wires to the ignition on circuit, so you're going to have that for your oil, for your fuel pump power. You've also got one that goes back to the fuel pump, so you still got to run the 2 extra wires the length of the car to satisfy that. And it's also got one that goes to the starter solenoid circuit, okay, the big purple wire in the engine compartment there that operates your solenoid when you hit start position. And the way it's wired is when you first turn on the ignition, of course, power comes to the switch, but nothing happens. It doesn't go anywhere. When you turn the key to start, of course, you are now powering the start terminal on this switch, which transfers power to the pump wire. So that makes the fuel pump start to run anytime you have it in the start position. That will greatly reduce the amount of time it takes to fill the carburetors up, because unlike this switch, you're not waiting for the oil pressure to build up first before it closes the contacts. This one has the contacts already closed, so as soon as you power the starter, the pump starts to run. Once the engine starts and oil pressure is built up, those 2 contacts open and the switch then powers the pump through the ignition controlled circuit. So this one doesn't ground any of the wires. It simply switches between them, whereas this style grounds the oil pressure switch, oil light. Okay, so this one works a little bit differently. The oil light switch connects up to the pump wire, because when the pump is not running, it allows the oil light on the dash to illuminate through the windings of the pump. So your oil light will still work, but this is a better way if you choose to do the oil pressure switch type of safety switch. And it's a special one made just for this purpose. It's available from Carter. Okay. Another way to do it is a more modern electronic way. This is a special module. It's made by a company called Revolution Products. They make a bunch of little neat modules which do stuff. This is the fuel pump safety switch. They also make an intermittent wiper switch. They make one for automatic dimming of the interior lights and stuff. They make some pretty cool stuff. They're available from Amazon or right from their website. And what this one does, it monitors the tach signal. So you're still going to have to run a wire from the your instrument panel area back through the car to the ignition coil to the negative side of the coil, just like a tach. Now, if you've already got a tachometer in your car, basically you've already got that wire run. So if you do have a tach, you only need to run the wire to the tachometer. It'll pick up the signal there. So what it does is when you first turn the ignition to on, it'll automatically power your electric fuel pump for 3 seconds. And then After the 3 seconds, it shuts the pump off until a signal is seen from the tachometer, meaning the engine is running. Then, of course, the pump will start to go. And when the engine stops running, whether you stall it or it's in a collision, whatever the case may be, the fuel pump circuit is opened up then. It's no longer running. So that's kind of a neat electronic way of doing it. Now, if the car's been sitting a long time, you may need to cycle the ignition maybe twice. 3 seconds might not be long enough to fill the carburetors up. So you might need to turn it on for 3 seconds, shut it off, turn it on again. That way you'll get the 6 seconds worth of time of the pump running to fill up the carb. So it's a neat little electronic module. They're not real expensive. That's kind of a trick way. The only thing about these which monitor the tach signal or the oil pressure is it's making the assumption that when your car's in a wreck that the engine's going to quit running. And a lot of times they do, but it's not a certainty. I mean, what if you crash the front of your Corvair? Does that mean that the engine would quit? Well, if it was a stick shift car, probably, because as soon as you got to stop the car moving, if you weren't pushing the clutch down or in neutral, the engine would die. If it's an automatic car, not necessarily. It might just still be idling away, and the safety switches would think everything's fine because it's got a tach signal, it's got oil pressure. So it's not exactly nothing's foolproof, but that's a possibility that I could see happening. And by the way, on that note, when you wire up the safety switch, you always wire the positive power side of the switch, of the pump through the switch, not the negative side. Why is that? If the car got rear-ended, you know the first thing, rear-ended hard, the Corvair, the first thing that's going to get whacked, I pretty much guarantee you, is the oil filter adapter plate where your generator, alternator, fuel pump, all that stuff lives, because that's the closest thing to the back of the car. And if that area gets badly damaged, what's the possibility of the fuel pump wire becoming grounded? Pretty fair. So if you ran the ground wire for the pump through the safety switch, the car gets rear-ended, the wires get pinched and grounded, what happens? It's just completed the circuit. The pump's going to keep running because now the circuit is grounded unintentionally through the damage. So you always want to run the positive power through here. So if the car gets damaged like that, it'll blow the fuse, the pump will stop. Okay. What I like instead is a inertia switch. This is a special vibration sensitive switch that is mounted somewhere in the car, and we'll give you examples of where I have mounted them, and it senses an impact on the car. This is a system that Ford used for many years through the 90s. They mounted it in the trunk of a car, and what it does, got a little push button on here. We push it down, and if it detects an impact, I'm just going to drop it there, the switch is interrupted, and you have to press the button again to make the switch operate. So it's a normally closed switch. When the button is pushed down, it senses an impact and it opens the circuit. It's very simple. You hook this up in line with the power wire that goes to the pump. And of course, because it's normally closed circuit, so it's powering the pump, you turn the ignition on, the pump starts immediately. You wait a few seconds for the carburetors to fill up, you start the car. If you mount it somewhere on a Corvair in the trunk area or under the dash area, you've got a minimum amount of wiring. There's no need to run it wires all the way through the back of the car. It's pretty easy to install, and it does the job. And of course, since it's detecting the impact, it's not reliant upon the engine stopping. It's not making the assumption. It doesn't care whether the engine's running or not. If the car gets whacked hard, it will open up the circuit. So that's a neat little one. It's easy to install and wire up. Just like our fuel pumps, there are copycats. Okay, this product is made by Standard Motor Products. It's their FV7. If you look on the internet, these switches are typically in the They retail in the $50 to $60 range, somewhere around there. And if you look on the internet, you'll find some out there for like $23. I said, well, that's a bargain. I'll buy that one. Well, it looks the same. It's the same colors. It looks like the switch. Some of them even have the same part number, but it's not made by Standard Products. It's a Chinese copycat part. And the ones that I have found are wired incorrectly from the factory. That's one way you can tell. Normally, there's a wiring harness that comes with it. And the outboard terminals, there's 3 terminals here on the switch so that it can be used either normally open or normally closed. The output wires are on the outside. The middle terminal is not used to facilitate it being a normally closed when depressed. The aftermarket or copycat is wired wrong. The 2 wires are close together, so they're not using one of the outside terminals. You figure, oh, this is going to be great. I saved myself 25 bucks, and I'm going to just plug this thing into the car, just like that, and you put it on, and you can't get the fuel pump to work. You know, what the heck's wrong with this thing? Pushing the button and everything? Well, the wires are on the connector wrong. You got to take the wires out and put them so they're on the outboard side, not together. And then, because it's wired to be normally open, not normally closed. So that's one way you can tell the copycat ones, besides the part number and the purchase price. So will the copycat one work? I don't know. Do you suppose they actually tested these to see what kind of impact it takes to open the switch? I don't know. Do you want to take a chance on that for 25 bucks? Buy the Standard Products unit, and it'll be an easy and safe way to do it. This is the style that I prefer and recommend. Okay, I think that about wraps up the first part of this video. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of the different kinds of fuel pumps, what they sound like, what they're capable of, and the overview of our safety products that you should have with your pump and some of the supporting hardware for the pumps. Now don't worry about all the part numbers that I was talking about when we identified some of these units. I have a complete list of every part number and manufacturer and websites, if there are some, that I've included in this video. All you have to do is email me at vershop@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to email you that list so you don't have to listen to the video 10 times to get a part number. The second part will be installation instructions. That'll be Corvair specific. So if you've got a different kind of car, it might not help you too much, but there will be some tips on there that you can use on any car. So we'll catch you next time.